You're listening to the Cyberwire Network, powered by N2K.
Getting everyone on the same page with baseline expectations is important. The one thing that's mentioned pretty clearly is vulnerability scanning. What I think doesn't get mentioned as much is that human-led testing capability and really integrating human-led testing into the security fabric of the organization.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Caveat, N2K Cyberwire's privacy, surveillance, law, and policy podcast. I'm Dave Bittner, and joining me is my co-host Ben Yellen from the University of Maryland Center for Health and Homeland Security. Hey there, Ben.
Hello, Dave.
On today's show, Ben does a deep dive into one of the biggest misconceptions about the First Amendment. I look at the fallout from an alleged Chinese hack of a U.S. telecom surveillance program. And later in the show, Ben's conversation with Katie Bowen, VP and General Manager of Global Public Sector and Defense at SYNAC, sharing her thoughts on CISA's new guidance on federal civilian executive branch operational cybersecurity alignment. That's a great interview, so do stay tuned for that. While this show covers legal topics and Ben is a lawyer, the views expressed do not constitute legal advice. For official legal advice on any of the topics we cover, please contact your attorney. Quick question. Do your end users always, and I mean always without exception, work on company-owned devices and IT-approved apps? I didn't think so. So my next question is, how do you keep your company's data safe when it's sitting on all those unmanaged apps and devices? 1Password has an answer to this question: Extended Access Management. 1Password Extended Access Management helps you secure every sign-in for every app on every device because it solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. And it's now available to companies with Okta and Microsoft Entra and in beta for Google Workspace customers. Check it out at 1password.com/cyberwire. That's 1password.com/cyberwire. All right, Ben, before we get to our stories here, we have a kind note from one of our listeners named Kevin, who wrote in and says, I read an article that discussed the importance of understanding negligence and negligence per se in lawsuits related to ransomware. As more statutes are being created, will this increase the cases that rely on the negligence per se doctrine? Is this a good thing? Will it increase the responsibility on small businesses to keep up with the growing number of statutes and regulations? Of course, I'm not implying that this trend would be beneficial to attorneys. No, not at all. All right. What does this mean, Ben? What's negligence per se versus good old garden variety negligence?
Good old straight negligence. Well,
right.
Negligence per se is when there is a statutorily defined case of negligence based on a particular action without the usual judgment you would give for a negligence case. So the usual judgment is you're measured against a reasonable person. So if we're talking about a normal tort like a car accident, your behavior is measured against what a reasonable person would have done in similar circumstances. And if we're talking about something like medical malpractice, you get a subject matter expert to come into the court proceeding and say, this is what a reasonable surgeon would have done. Maybe you accidentally snipped off somebody's eyeball, and that's not customary in this field of medicine.
Right.
What negligence per se is some legislative body, or it could be a court decision, says if you take this action without diving too deeply into whether a reasonable person would have done this counts as negligence in the eyes of the law.
So it's spelled out.
It's spelled out.
Okay.
So that would be a big deal. It would be a big deal, and I think it would be a big deal for cybersecurity writ large.
Do you think that there will be intentionality in trying to avoid that kind of specificity?
I don't know. The lawyers have a lot of influence, and yes, I do think there will be some pushback on it, certainly from the industry, which wants to avoid subjecting themselves to all of this litigation. I think the industry always prefers the carrot approach over the stick approach.
Right.
Where, yeah, I mean, we've often seen proposals where a company would have an affirmative defense that they use proper cybersecurity practices, that they comply with NIST standards. And that's the approach that the industry prefers because they're rewarded for taking these good steps without being punished for refusing to do so.
I see. Yeah.
So a broad doctrinal shift to negligence per se, I think would be bad for the industry. So yeah, I do think there would be a pushback on it for sure.
Right. Interesting. Well, thank you, Kevin, for writing in. And of course, we would love to hear from you. If there's something you'd like us to consider for the show, you can email us. It's caveat@n2k.com.
I love how he referred to himself as the sarcastic gadfly. Socratic gadfly.
Socratic
I'm
gadfly.
so sorry.
Yes. Or both.
Or both. Yeah, it could be both.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's jump into our stories here. Ben, why don't you kick things off for us?
So I'm going to go in a bit of a different direction than usual. We've frequently referenced this axiom, this First Amendment axiom that you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. The reason this is relevant is oftentimes when somebody's arguing that the First Amendment is absolute, you get another person saying there are exceptions to the First Amendment. The First Amendment doesn't cover hate speech, which is false. It does. And they'll often say the First Amendment wouldn't permit you to yell fire in a crowded theater.
Right.
The reason this is relevant now is we had our vice presidential debate a couple of weeks ago. And if you were unfortunate enough to watch that whole debate, you would have seen vice presidential candidate on the Democratic side, Tim Walz, falsely make this statement. He was talking about how there aren't constitutional protections for misinformation and hate speech. Again, spoiler alert, that's wrong. And then he resorted to this trope that you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. So I wanted to dig into that. Can you really not yell fire in a crowded theater?
Well, I mean, can we just talk first of all about how obvious that seems? Like, I think maybe that's the reason why it's such a popular trope, because it makes such good sense.
It does make intuitive sense. But I think once you get into the history of it, the context of where that statement came from, and then if you go into the nuance of the actual question, you'll realize why it's just a complete oversimplification.
All right.
So there are a couple of things here. There's the context of that line, and then there's like looking at it literally and doctrinally. Can you yell fire in a crowded theater? I want to start with the history here. So this comes from a 1919 case called Schenck versus United States.
Over 100 years ago.
100 years ago, yeah. The justice who wrote the majority opinion in that case was Oliver Wendell Holmes. And in dicta, which means it was not crucial to the actual decision in the case, Oliver Wendell Holmes was justifying restrictions on the First Amendment by saying, and I quote, the First Amendment wouldn't permit you to falsely shout fire in a theater. Notice two things here. There's the falsely, that's critically important, and people frequently leave that out. And then it didn't say crowded theater. He just said a theater, which is something, it's weird that that's kind of, through a game of telephone, been mistranslated over the years.
Right.
But that comes from a case in which the holding was that somebody, a group of people protesting the draft during World War I didn't have First Amendment rights in that protest. Basically that it would potentially put our troops in danger if we had discord at home with people refusing to join, to respond to getting their draft summons and showing up to be part of the Army or the Navy during World War I. And that decision, as you can imagine, has become pretty discredited. Obviously now, we would recognize that the First Amendment protects people's right to protest literally anything. I mean, if the First Amendment protects your right to go to Skokie, Illinois, which has a high Jewish population, and dress up as a bunch of neo-Nazis and protest, of course you're allowed to protest a military draft. Can you imagine what the 1960s would have been like if just protesting the military draft had become criminalized? So it's a discredited opinion, not just in the eyes of history, but in the eyes of Justice Holmes himself, who really shied away from citing his own opinion in Schenck versus the United States. In future opinions, he was much more deferential to those First Amendment rights. As we made our way towards the 1950s and the 1960s, the sort of narrow exception to the First Amendment when we're talking about speech creating a clear and present danger to the public, they really narrowed that test in a case called Brandenburg versus Ohio. And speech is only criminalized if it would lead to, quote, imminent lawless action. So that's a high standard. You can speak theoretically about some type of danger. You could wax poetically about how you think it would be better if the president were dead. But unless your speech would cause imminent lawless action, unless you were speaking in front of a mob and the mob was likely to heed your words and go shoot the president, then that is protected First Amendment speech. Which leads us to fire in a crowded theater. There are a bunch of circumstances where you could shout fire in a crowded theater, Dave. For one, if there were actually a fire. Notice that in that opinion, he says falsely shouting fire in a theater. People often get this confused. So that's one circumstance.
Really?
Yeah, if there were actually a fire, you can shout fire.
No. I'm saying I always figured that was implied, that the falsely was implied, that the idea here was that you get in trouble if you whip up a frenzy where people can get injured. Like, I always figured that was the peril here.
It is implied, but it's kind of worth saying that people often leave out, including Tim Walz for that matter, often leave out the falsely part of it.
Okay.
Then there's, would it actually be criminal to falsely shout fire in a crowded theater? My answer is that it depends on the circumstance. If it would cause imminent lawless action, some type of stampede that would imperil people's safety, then yes, you can criminalize it. And there are states where there are statutes prohibiting false reports of an emergency. And so that is not protected speech. That can be criminalized. People can be arrested and prosecuted. But there are circumstances where somebody could falsely shout fire in a crowded theater when it would be constitutionally protected speech. Because you have this high standard of imminent lawless action, if somebody shouted fire in a crowded theater, but in a way that not anybody could hear them, maybe it was during intermission, and they shouted it at a low volume, that type of speech wouldn't be likely to lead to imminent lawless action, and therefore it could not be criminalized. If you were putting on a play production about Oliver Wendell Holmes and the Schenck decision, and in the middle of that play production, you falsely shouted fire in that theater as part of your show, that's also constitutionally protected First Amendment speech. So we're really only talking about a narrow set of circumstances when somebody violates a law, and there has to be a state statute in existence criminalizing this type of activity, where you cause lawless action, you cause people to get injured by making this false statement. You have to have the type of influence where people would listen to you and start evacuating the theater, and it would actually have to cause a certain type of harm in order for that to be criminalized. So I think there's like the backlash to this, which I've been covering here, and then I kind of think there should be a backlash to the backlash. Like, I think a normal person probably would understand that you can't falsely shout fire in a crowded theater, and they're picturing a circumstance where somebody's causing a stampede.
Right.
And like that still is technically illegal. I just think, given all of the context here, the history of that case, how it's been discredited, and the fact that there are circumstances in which you can falsely shout fire in a crowded theater, it's not per se unprotected speech. I think that context is important. So I'm here for the backlash, and I'm also here for the backlash to the backlash.
Okay. I think most people probably understand this or understand what the metaphor is about, that it's not, isn't it fair to say that this is all about the metaphor and not so much the literal? It's about, again, I say, whipping up a frenzy where people would get harmed. That's the problem here.
It is. And the problem with using this as a metaphor is, in most circumstances in which it's used as a metaphor, it's used as a justification to criminalize speech. And in 99.9% of those circumstances, the First Amendment does not allow you to criminalize that speech, including what Tim Walz was talking about in the debate, which is misinformation online. That is not a category of speech that is unprotected under our First Amendment. People often say things like hate speech or online hate speech is not protected First Amendment speech. And to justify that, they'll bring up the fire in the crowded theater thing. So I think it's important to just do that deep dive and say, that is not your get out of the First Amendment jail, get out of jail free First Amendment card. It is not as good of a point as you think it is. When we understand the context of it and that our First Amendment is really, really robust. Just because something's offensive, just because something is false, doesn't mean it loses its First Amendment protection. There are a tiny category, a tiny list of categories of the types of speech that are unprotected. So things like false advertising or defamation against a private individual or so-called fighting words, which would cause physical violence, or words that would lead to imminent lawless action. Beyond that relatively limited list, which also includes things like CSAM, certain other types of obscenity, you can object to the speech as much as you want, but it is protected under the First Amendment. Our First Amendment is strong, and your fire in a crowded theater trope will not make it any weaker.
So mostly, if you bring up this to bolster your argument, and there are any constitutional scholars in the room, you will be bowled over at the force of them rolling their eyes.
They will bang their head against the wall. So I will be among those banging their head against the wall. But then after I've given myself a concussion, I will come back and say, I get your point that the First Amendment really wouldn't protect somebody in that particular circumstance where you're shouting fire in a crowded theater and it leads to a stampede that gets people injured, and the state has some type of statute criminalizing false reporting of an emergencies. Yes, it's not First Amendment protected speech. So grant the person those facts. But also understand that it is kind of a stupid trope and it's not a very good metaphor because there are just very few circumstances in our First Amendment jurisprudence where that speech is not going to be protected. So it's not a clever line.
I also I think about that there are some laws that are on the books to be proactive and there are laws that are on the books to be reactive. Let me explain. So it seems to me like, it's before the movie has begun, right? The lights are still on in the theater. The theater is almost full. People are sitting down. Let's say it's a movie theater. They got their popcorn. They got their drinks. The good people are turning off their phones.
Bad people are still texting.
Right.
Yep.
And some knucklehead decides to get up and go down to the little, aisle down at the front of the theater in front of the screen, throw their hands up in the air and yell, "Fire! Fire! Fire!" Now, if there is a stampede based on that, then it seems to me like reactively, when they're figuring out how they're going to throw the book at this person, they're going to pull out that statute and say, aha, right?
Yes, exactly.
But if nothing happens and everybody just laughs.
Look, it's a crazy guy shouting fire in a crowded theater.
They're not going to go proactive because everybody looks around and says, well, there's
no fire. I don't smell any smoke.
There's no fire.
Oh, wait, that's just the smoke emanating from my buttered popcorn.
Right,
it's fine.
Right. So in that case, they're not going to be proactive about going after a person who did something with no effect.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And that's why this is such an ineffective trope, because you're only talking about an extremely limited circumstance where somebody is so overwhelmingly convincing to that audience that people do evacuate and do get injured. Let's say somebody yells fire in a crowded theater, and it turns out there was no fire in that theater, but they had a reasonable belief that there was a fire. Let's say they smell smoke.
Right.
And they say fire, and everybody evacuates. That is constitutionally protected speech. Because it's not the type of speech that would cause imminent lawless action. There's nothing lawless about it.
And it wasn't falsely called out. They believed that they smelled smoke.
They had a reasonable belief that they smelled smoke. Exactly. So again, we're narrowing down the circumstances where this could ever actually be a thing.
Do you know if this has ever happened?
I don't know if this has ever happened. certainly Oliver Wendell Holmes was not talking about an actual scenario in his hypothetical. He didn't reference like the Great Fire of whatever. I think there probably have been some historical examples of this, and maybe Oliver Wendell Holmes, I'm sure some history nerds could look this up, was inspired by a particular incident. But I don't think we have like a worldwide phenomenon of people falsely shouting fire in a theater and, everybody else evacuating. Now, we do have things like doxing and swatting, which is what I was going to mention next. That's not constitutionally protected speech, and that would be a textbook definition of false reporting of an emergency. One of many things, many statutes you could use to prosecute somebody for that.
Yeah, leading to lawless action.
Right, because people could get hurt in those circumstances. So that's one circumstance where it's analogous. But the millions of others that most people use, things like hate speech, certain other types of online speech, not fire in a crowded theater. It's just not.
So the lesson is retire this phrase from your list of metaphors.
Yes, it just does more harm than good.
Okay. Be kind to your local constitutional scholar and stop using this trope.
Yeah. Just don't do it. If you have used it and you want to be vindicated, I think you can make a theoretical case that there are circumstances where falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater would get somebody arrested. So good for you. You've established that. Now stop. Now knock it off.
Well, actually.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well.
And now we never have to talk about this again, right?
Oh, Ben. We both know that's not true.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on. My story this week, this is from the folks over at Cyberscoop. And recently we had this story from the Wall Street Journal that allegedly some hackers tied to Beijing, Chinese, breached the networks of Verizon, AT&T, and Lumen Technologies. And specifically what they breached were the legal backdoors into these communication networks that are used for searches or wiretapping.
Yeah, court-ordered wiretaps.
Court-ordered, yeah, that was what I was looking for. So when you have a court order to wiretap someone, this is how they go about it. And those backdoors are mandated by some legislation. And there's always been this notion, there's been this worry that any backdoor you create can be used by bad guys as much as good guys.
And everybody who's made that argument, in my mind, is now vindicated.
Yeah, right. Well, and so this is related to the encryption arguments, whether or not we should be allowed to have encrypted communications and whether there should be backdoors into that. This really proves that case. And what we've got now is that members of Congress are asking for more information about this whole incident. And I guess conspicuously, Senator Ron Wyden is leading the charge here.
Whenever he's in the picture, you know it's serious. And you know it's about government surveillance.
That's right. That's right. So he's been critical of both the telecom companies and the feds for their role in creating these vulnerabilities. And he cited something called CALEA, which is the Communications Assistance to Law Enforcement Act, which I suppose is the enabling legislation that made all this possible.
Yeah.
Yeah. So ahead of the game, he's kind of encouraging that there are some reforms to CALEA, that everybody needs to do a better job. But I think beyond everybody doing a better job of locking this down, there is the overarching belief by a lot of folks who advocate for privacy that that's impossible, that you can't lock this down. If you create the back door, it's always going to be a vulnerability. And in this case, we think that our adversaries were in our networks for months.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to use a real world metaphor there, but let's say you told your spouse, I'm going to leave our back door unlocked at our house in case the police need to get in when somebody's coming to rob us. would that not sound kind of ridiculous? Like, you are leaving that back door open for the bad guy, and they are going to exploit that vulnerability. And that's exactly what happened here. I think Wyden is right to criticize this communications assistant to law enforcement. CALEA, most discussions around CALEA have been about how to expand it to prohibit things like end-to-end encryption in the types of databases or records that the government might need access to through court orders, whether that's through Title III of the Wiretap Act or through something like FISA if it's a foreign intelligence matter. And I think now we need to start looking at reforms to reward and or punish companies who are using lax cybersecurity practices and leaving these back doors unprotected. And I think if there is a groundswell for this, I think that's something that we could see happen in the future, where members of Congress come together. This is something where the backlash has been bipartisan. Tighten up those cybersecurity controls on these private networks in question here.
Do you suppose that this will have an effect on the encryption argument? I mean, this will always be wielded as a real-world example of what can happen.
Yeah, I mean, we've been having the encryption wars for a decade now, more, and this is fuel to the fire. It always seemed to be very hypothetical, like there are a lot of malign actors out there, and if we leave open these back doors for law enforcement, then some of these bad actors are going to get in. And now you have something that's tangible that just happened. I think it's ammunition for the privacy side in these wars, and I think this is something that they'll point to as they make the case for significant reforms.
Do you think it's safe to say that this isn't going away, though? I mean, their law enforcement is not going to give up this ability.
No, and law enforcement will say, and I'm not sure what the private companies will say about this. They probably see it as an inconvenience, but certainly federal and state law enforcement would say, we don't want to drown the baby with the bathwater. If you institute punishments and restrictions and exorbitant costs on us to protect the security of these networks, we don't want to risk losing the ability to have access to these records because we need them for law enforcement purposes. So yeah, I don't think law enforcement nor privacy advocates are going to go down here without a fight. I think this is just fuel to the fire for those privacy advocates because they've been saying this for years. And I want to know what law enforcement's answer to this problem is. And I think it's incumbent upon law enforcement agencies to take this seriously and to address it.
I'm speculating here, but do you think it's probably fair to say that up to this point, the responsibility for the security of these back doors has been placed on the communications companies, Verizon, AT&T, and Lumen in this case?
Yeah, although there have been some requirements for the federal government when we're talking about the Department of Justice and getting access to these records. But yeah, most of the effort has been in the private sector.
I guess what I'm getting at is, could this be an opportunity for those companies to shift some of that burden to say probably the easiest way is to say, okay, look, you need to write us a blank check.
Right.
Right?
If you're going to make us institute these practices for you,
right, then,
yeah, show me the money.
Right. Here's what happens when you trust us to do this. So, I'm being glib, but, let's collaborate. Let's agree. Let's make this the most secure thing ever. And that's not going to be cheap. So this can't be an unfunded mandate.
Right. And the government loves nothing more than unfunded mandates.
That's true.
You have to do something, and we are not going to give you the money to do it.
Right.
And I'm sure the lobbyists for these companies will fight tooth and nail to prevent that from happening. And they probably have a pretty good chance at succeeding. It's not like this is the most salient issue in the world. I know I always bring that up, and it's kind of a buzzkill, but there aren't hundreds of thousands of people in the streets protesting about backdoors. So
that's true.
The path of least resistance is inertia.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of a black eye for everybody involved, though. It's embarrassing.
It is embarrassing. And it's total vindication for people who have been saying this for years.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad members of Congress have taken notice.
I guess in some ways we're lucky that there is bipartisan interest in this, because you're not going to see that, especially where we are today, election coming up, unprecedented division among everybody, that one side will grasp this and just start pounding the other over this. I think everybody agrees that this was not good and needs some reform.
Right. I think that's completely true.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will have links to all of our stories in the show notes. And again, we would love to hear from you. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, you can email us. It's caveat@n2k.com. Around every entry point and every clever attacker, Vectra sees the attacks others can't. How? Vectra has AI on it. Vectra's AI attack signal intelligence tells security teams where to focus, what matters. It wades through thousands of individual threat events so you don't have to. Attackers infiltrating your network? Vectra has AI on it. Attackers compromising your identities? Vectra has AI on it. Vectra AI, the integrated signal powering your XDR. Visit vectra.ai/showme to learn more. That's vectra.ai/showme to learn more. Ben, you recently had the pleasure of speaking with Katie Bowen, who is a VP and General Manager of Global Public Sector and Defense for CINAC, and she was sharing her thoughts on CISA's new guidance on Federal Civilian Executive Branch, Operational Cybersecurity Alignment Plan, and Federal Vulnerability Management Practices. That's a lot to say, but it actually is a pretty interesting topic here. Here's Ben and Katie Bowen.
Well, it is so good to have you here. I wanted to start at a very high level, talking about vulnerability management capabilities among our federal agencies. What would you say is the proper lay of the land? What keeps you up at night in terms of vulnerabilities for our federal agencies? And have you seen significant improvement over the past decade or so?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. What keeps me up at night is the rise of AI tools used by our adversaries. It's really going to come down to patching within minutes and seconds, critical vulnerabilities that are discovered either in third-party software or within native applications and infrastructure. And today we are able to help our customers track and manage reducing mean time to remediation from months to weeks or days in some cases, but it's really going to come down to minutes and seconds and how we see it happening very quickly.
And I want you to, if you can, just dive into the use of these AI tools. What does that entail exactly? Like, what are our adversaries attempting to do, and how are they using AI tools against us?
Yeah, they're building scripts, bots, and other pieces of software with AI components that help them seek and find vulnerabilities faster than a human would previously. We're already seeing earlier this year, some great papers came out about the use of GPT-4 specifically and the compute power that GPT enables in order to conduct exploits somewhat remotely and with very little technical direction. So these are the things that all contribute to really wanting to work with our customers more closely to enable integrations with well-loved enterprise tooling to get vulnerability data into the hands of those that can fix those vulnerabilities faster and help them with as much information as possible in order to remediate.
Can you give us just like some potential horror stories in terms of if these vulnerabilities are able to get through to these federal agencies? Like, is it critical infrastructure that you're worried about? Is it the interruption of military affairs, our defense industry? I mean, what are the sort of kinetic impacts that worry you the most?
I guess the civilian cabinet level agencies, there's a whole bunch of PII or personal identifiable information that exists. There's how things are being transported within our country comes to mind. And plenty of other opportunities for what seems like a basic web application to be exploited. And if things aren't locked down properly on the back end, you can imagine what lateral movement, once somebody is in, an adversary is into the system, can do. When it comes to defense systems or mission systems, specifically in the intelligence and Department of Defense space, that's a whole nother can of worms that makes things a lot scarier, a lot faster.
So, what kind of systemic improvements do you need? I mean, I know in your work you help out individual clients, but just from a policy level, what what do we need to do legislatively or through regulatory affairs to help expedite our ability to attack these vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I think what CISA is doing is huge and important with the federal cabinet level agencies, kind of baselining what is expected or required from an outcome perspective. And I know they recently released some new verbiage and plan around the focal plan, the FCEB Operational Cybersecurity Alignment Plan. And there's some really great information in there that is a baseline expectation. It's taken the civilian government several years to help bring along the leadership within those agencies to baseline this. There's been a lot of competing priorities, obviously, changes in administration that have contributed to requiring that alignment by CISA. You know, getting everyone on the same page with baseline expectations is important. The one thing that's mentioned pretty clearly is vulnerability scanning. What I think doesn't get mentioned as much as that human-led testing capability and really integrating human-led testing into the security fabric of the organization.
Do you worry at all? I mean, we're going to have a presidential transition, no matter what, I suppose, from November into January. Do you worry that there might be some fragmentation with these efforts as the transition takes place, as there are changes in personnel? I mean, what are you and your clients thinking about as we approach that transition?
Yeah, I think the change in administration comes into play in a lot of decisions that aren't being made over the last few months going into the election period here. Another year without a budget, and we're under a continuing resolution right now, also impacts a lot of decisions being made. But many budgets are multi-year, and cybersecurity is an important use of funds to protect our nation and our nation's people. So I'm, hopeful that there's not too much disruption and that a lot of the best laid plans by the really smart leaders that are in the cybersecurity space that have been made over the last few years will continue to be carried out.
And do you have concerns or confidence that we're going to have the right personnel in place, particularly with the leadership of CISA? And what kind of individual are you looking at as we look at a potential future administration, no matter what happens in November?
Yeah, Jen Easterly has done some incredible work for our country, and she's well respected and revered by CISOs across and security and intelligence leaders across the federal government. I was just in a CISO's office the other day who was singing her praises, even though he's not specifically under the CISA purview, just for what she's been able to accomplish in her career. We're really grateful for all the things that she's laid out and the continued direction and strategy that her and her team are delivering to our customers, as well as the federal government and Congress at large. I think, CISOs having a seat at the table is always on my mind. When we talk about shifting left in pen testing or security testing with our customers into the software development lifecycle, and how the attestation and provenance of software coming into an organization will be evaluated. I think it's just like the revolution we went through with DevSecOps over the last 10 to 15 years. We have to think about how to shift left with security testing as well. So there's probably a lot to unpack there, but those are the kind of things that we would love to see more guidance and direction on.
Sure. And then we've talked kind of at a macro level about policy changes, but just for individual agencies, you talk about the need to defend systems more proactively. What does that look like in practice? What are the types of things that you're advising in your work with SINAC?
Yeah, so maybe riffing off of the DevSecOps parallel, we talk about, and a lot in the federal government, we talk about continuous integration, continuous delivery. We talk about continuous ATO, or authority to operate. And when you're, attesting to specific RMF or other requirements around continuous monitoring, you get to pass go once a year for your annual health checkup, if you will. So we think a lot about that in security testing as well. Like, if we can do this continuously, and as you're delivering more code to pre-production environments, or even committing it, how do we continuously test that so that less vulnerabilities are getting to production, period, and developers are learning faster about how to stop creating new vulnerabilities.
So it's more about integrating vulnerability assessments and vulnerability management in all types of code creation, and also just the building of new systems within agencies. So changing the culture so that when a new system goes online, it goes online with a greater understanding of those vulnerabilities, and just the cybersecurity folks are in on the ground floor, in other words.
Exactly. And it's tough to all work together. We get it. I worked in the cloud native development space prior to coming to SNAG. And, you talk about throwing things over the wall to have them run and tested. And you forget what you do if you don't, you forget what you did if you don't hear back from that team for 2 or 3 months. So it really is a cultural thing. And we talk a lot about the cultural transformation that continuous security testing provides, especially when you get closer to those system owners and developers.
And it seems like in the private sector, that might be something that you have that level of adaptability. You're constantly worried about your bottom line, losing your competitive advantage. So when you need to make those changes, you make them. What worries me about federal agencies is and I don't know if you've seen this in your work, there's a concern about just the stasis of a bureaucracy. Do you see that? And do you see ways that we can sort of overcome that as a barrier?
Yeah, I think a lot of agencies utilize systems integrators as contractor developers, or other boutique firms. They're typically competed. They compete that work typically for delivery purposes. Sometimes there's an evaluation of, how can we require certain behaviors or activities or outcomes in those contracts or in those RFPs that will benefit positively the security outcomes of the code that's delivered. So that's sometimes an outcome from having these types of conversations. And one way to work toward that systemic change that you mentioned. I worked in the commercial space for several years with big banks and telcos. It's not all that different. They're big organizations. There's pockets of innovation. There's pockets of bureaucracy hacking. And when you have a leader that's really, really cares about changing the imperative to better security practices throughout the process, and arming that leader with information and data so that they can help coach those teams, you have a win on your hands. And it's really about how you keep the antibodies from the organization from killing that cultural transformation that's so important to moving the needle on security.
I thought it might be good to end on an optimistic note. I mean, can you reflect on, just in your time in the industry and over the past several years, what you're most proud of, both in terms of your own work and just how our systems have evolved to be more receptive to rooting out these vulnerabilities? I mean, what specifically has changed that gives you encouragement for the future?
The last year and a half or so at Synac, we've seen customers who just got visibility into their vulnerabilities and their attack surface, and how to strategically create a plan around managing their attack surface with security testing, to now saying, hey, I need to integrate this capability so that I can get information into our developers' hands faster. So they're saying, can we use enterprise integrations? How do we create our own path to delivering information faster throughout the organization? And I think that's why we saw a significant decrease in the number of days that it takes to remediate a vulnerability in the last year when we released our State of Vulnerabilities report recently. That's been a huge impact and a huge shift I've been seeing. Just talking more with customers about how they can, set a benchmark within their organization and beat it every year and then celebrate it. And I think that's been probably a really big sense of accomplishment for our team as well. getting to have those conversations and help the customers get that data integrated into their enterprise systems.
And just in case people aren't going to read the full vulnerabilities report, although I will recommend it, it says that your federal customers remediated vulnerabilities 35% faster in 2023 than they did in 2022. So certainly cause for celebration and encouragement.
We wholeheartedly agree, and we want to drive that number even further down with our customers. We get to look at the aggregate of data across our customers and make some really cool deductions about it. So thank you. Thank you for having me on, Ben.
Interesting stuff here, Ben. I mean, what in particular caught your ear here in this conversation? What were the highlights for you?
I think the sort of macro positive view that the federal government is getting better in vulnerability management capabilities, and her organization has the statistics to back it up. I think there are a lot of challenges that remain, but rarely do we have an interview where the headline is good news, Dave.
Right. It's a shining beacon of optimism, right?
Yep.
All right. Well, again, our thanks to Katie Bowen from SYNAC for joining us. We do appreciate her taking the time. And now, a word from our sponsor, Cortex. Security teams face a barrage of more security tools, create more complexity. More devices need protection. More specialized focus areas create more silos. The security landscape is changing fast. How can security operations transform to meet current threats? Cortex by Palo Alto Networks consolidates SecOps tools into an integrated platform and helps organizations stop threats at scale with AI, automation, and analytics. Learn more at paloaltonetworks.com/Cortex. That is our show. We want to thank all of you for listening. We'd love to know what you think of this podcast. Your feedback ensures we deliver the insights that keep you a step ahead in the rapidly changing world of cybersecurity. If you like our show, please share a rating and review in your favorite podcast app. Please also fill out the survey in the show notes or send an email to caveat@n2k.com. We're privileged that N2K Cyberwire is part of the daily routine of the most influential leaders and operators in the public and private sector, from the Fortune 500 to many of the world's preeminent intelligence and law enforcement agencies. N2K makes it easy for companies to optimize your biggest investment, your people. We make you smarter about your teams while making your team smarter. Learn how at n2k.com. This episode is produced by Liz Stokes. Our executive producer is Jennifer Iben. The show is mixed by Trey Hester. Our executive editor is Brandon Karpf. Peter Kilpie is our publisher. I'm Dave Bittner.
I'm Ben Yellen.
Thanks for listening.